welcome to my channel. Thank you for tuning in to Good Grief with me, Diva. I'm excited about our guest today. We've got lots to talk about. We've already been talking and we thought, oh my gosh, we haven't been recording, so we need to jump in. But before I introduce him, I would like you to hit that subscribe button and share it with those who need it, because that is the point of this podcast. So I am thrilled to be introducing Ben Stimpson. He is an integrative therapist, a spiritual director, award-winning author, podcaster, and independent scholar of folklore and history. A member of the modern and queer communities, Ben's personal life helps to inform his professional and research work. Ben holds a BA honors in medieval, classical, and religious studies from the University of Waterloo, a postgraduate diploma in spiritual psychotherapy, and a diploma in social service work. As a therapist, he excels in working with members of the queer community and other marginalized populations, and ascribes to transpersonal, systemic, and narrative approaches to therapy. He is the host of Essence Podcast, a weekly show interviewing fellow authors and practitioners in the field of alternative spirituality and therapy. His debut title, Ancestral Whispers, a guide to developing ancestral veneration practices, was released by Llewellyn Worldwide and won the 2024 gold medal at the COVR Awards. His second title, Wise Ones, Legends of Witches, Magicians, and Cunning Folk of England and Wales, is set to debut June 2025 through Crossed Crow Books. Ben, I am so excited to have you here. I know, right? That's so impressive.
It's really interesting, weird when you put all of that stuff down. Yeah, it's very strange.
It is. It's my worst nightmare when people say, can I have a bio? I'm like, I'll have one written that's easy to send, but and I'm sure it's even weirder for you to sit there and hear me spout it all off. But it's an impressive bio, and
Thank you.
Had an impressive career. So I'm so excited to talk to you. There's so many amazing facets to what you did. Now, I do have to clarify because I'm curious. You said University of Waterloo. Was that
in Canada?
In
Canada, yeah.
All right, awesome. I am originally from Canada, as I'm living in the Dominican Republic. So Canada is my...
I thought I recognized the accent. I was like, that's not like an American accent. So where are you, Vancouver, or are you from Ontario here?
No, I'm from Ontario. Yeah, and that's why when I saw University of Waterloo, because I used to live I grew up in Elora. So Waterloo, very close to Elora. And so when I saw that, I'm like, I wonder if...
I know Elora very well. I actually grew up in Hanover, so I'm like very close by.
Oh, you are close
just
by.
North. Yeah, very close by. Yeah. So I'm currently sitting, for those Canadians who are listening, I'm currently sitting in Wyreton, Ontario, near Wyreton Willie's big statue.
Oh, very nice. Those who don't know who Wyreton Willie is, he is the groundhog that comes out on Groundhog and lets us know how much longer winter will be, which is very important during Canadian winters, which is
very important.
And you live in like the northern or more north in Ontario. Wyreton is further north, so you get worse winters than I had in southern Ontario. So,
It's the weirdest thing though. Like, it's Owen Sound, which is only half an hour south of Wyreton, gets everything. And we're in this weird middle zone where we see the clouds rolling on the landscape, but we don't get much snow the past couple of years. So it's a weird thing, but yeah, Southern Ontario, as much as people think it's so far north, it's actually the same level as Northern California. It's the weirdest thing of how the continent works.
Oh, that is.
Because Point Pelee is the same level as San Francisco. You wouldn't have thought that, would you?
I would not have. I don't often look at a map to look either.
You live in the Caribbean, you don't need to look at maps anymore.
And my reasoning was because I was tired of scraping snow and ice off my car and shoveling. I think as we get older, we're like, oh, it's beautiful in pictures.
Yes, in pictures.
Yes. Although there are things about Canada that I miss, and I have contemplated moving back. It's lovely being by the beach and experiencing this. And I'm glad it's been almost a year and a half that I've been here. But there there are things in
There's
Canada that
certain
I miss,
things.
like family and friends. It's a consideration. So let's get into your work
Yes,
because
let's do it.
you were having some interesting conversations about, how as humans, we have a hard time surrendering control. And we were talking specifically in a grief process, we tend to want to control because the biggest thing we can't control is losing somebody.
Yeah.
And we were talking, we try so desperately to swim upstream instead of trying to go with the flow. So
Yeah.
let's tap into a little bit of your work and what you do and your observations in that area, because you're very in tune spiritually as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm excited about your book coming out.
Of
That's
course.
fascinating. How did you even get involved in the things that you're doing?
Of course. So the book that's going to be really relevant to our conversation is actually already out, so that you can get it. So
Oh,
it's Ancestral Whispers. I'll put it close to the thing there. Ancestral
okay.
Whispers, a guide to developing ancestral veneration practices. So that came out in September. And funnily enough, all of my work is about control in some way, right? Our issues with control, from my spiritual psychotherapy practice and to my work in ancestral veneration, to even the stories and the folklore and the stories and narratives that we tell about the marginalized population, like witches and magicians and whatnot, right? All
Mhm.
about control. And so I've been on quite a spiritual journey. Being from Canada, you may know the festival crowd up here, but I originally started to become really interested in magic and Wicca and all of that back in the 90s, like late 90s. Really started to become a big part of my life in the early 2000s. I remember going to the occult shop down in Toronto for the first time when I was like 15 or something like that, and just
Mhm.
being like enamored with it all, right? And at that point, I was having a big issue with control in my life. I just moved to Canada. I was dealing with culture shock. I came when I was 8 years old, so it's old enough to remember back home, but young enough that I didn't have a say in state. And
Right.
and it caused a lot of issues for me. So spirituality and folklore was my way of surviving bullying and dealing with culture shock and all of those pieces. What it also did was it separated me from the rest of my family. It was only my immediate family over here when we moved to Hanover. And it was the vast majority of my ancestors are all back in the UK. There was no access to the dead. There was no access to the living family. There was no access to family and connections. And so for me, the family and my dead were all stories. There were stories that were told. There were pictures that I could see in our pictures box, right? And vague remembrances of them. And that's it. That's all I had. So when I started getting into spirituality and reconnecting or connecting with different traditions, it was really strongly connected with Hinduism for a long time and still are in some ways. Buddhism, Wicca, magic, all of these. It was all jump started by stories from back home, stories of King Arthur, stories of Camelot. I
Right.
read the Mists of Avalon when I was a kid, and that really
Oh,
opened me
yes.
up. Yes, the Mists of Avalon.
Yes, I
You
read
know,
that too.
it was great. There's problems with it now, but it was great back then. But it just opened me up and it allowed me to survive. And it really developed who I was. Mid-20s, I was in this rut of, I don't know what to do in my life, not sure what I'm doing. And so one thing led to another. I started working as a vendor at psychic fairs. So I started going around to psychic fairs and selling crystals and things like that, just as like weekend job for myself. I connected with somebody who was eventually, I'd take a lot of courses with down in Kitchener. And from there, I then went and studied spiritual psychotherapy in Toronto as a way to jumpstart my career, going back into therapy. I wanted to work as a therapist. And then concurrently to that, I was also working with several spiritual groups. And one of them was a tradition that is Cuban based, but it's West African. And that's the Lukumi Santeria tradition. When I was studying in Toronto, I was studying in Hamilton, and my roommate who had invited me in was a priest of this tradition. And so I just became involved. And one of the big pieces to that tradition is ancestor veneration.
Mm.
And the big thing with ancestor veneration, and a lot of Westerners are like, oh, what is that? I don't know what that is. They assume that it must be like mourning processes and grief traditions, when it really is focused on life and relationships, right? So
Mhm.
the movie, I always like to say the movie Coco and Dia de los Muertos is a really good example of
Yeah.
ancestor veneration, right?
Yes.
Bringing the dead back in, inviting them back into life, into space within a safe way, right?
Yeah.
Because we don't want the dead all over the place. There's zones that they exist in, zones we exist within. They have to stay separate. But it's
Yeah.
developing a spiritual practice and how to communicate with them, how to work with them, how to safely have them in your home again, and how to relate with them now, as opposed to this Western model and idea of they're gone, they're away, they're never coming back from some other space. Even the language that was used, I noticed you used the word when we lose somebody.
Mm.
They're not lost. We know where they are, right?
Yeah.
But it's that English language, it's that Western mindset of, oh, suddenly they're avoid. What do we do when somebody dies? We don't talk about them anymore. It's too
Yeah.
uncomfortable. Oh, we don't want to bring up so-and-so because they died and it's going to cause this person grief, right? We don't want
Yeah.
to talk about people who've decided to suicide because, oh, well, that's shameful. Like, we don't want to. No, talk about it. Say their name. Remember them, right?
Yeah,
And,
absolutely. And I say that to a lot to my clients because when we have experienced the passing of a loved one, we're afraid to bring it up for making other people uncomfortable.
yeah,
And
yeah,
my thought on that is it's not about other people. This is about you and your process. And speak their name.
yeah,
Remember, that's part of the grief process as well, right? It's
exactly.
part of the acceptance and the understanding
Yes.
that things have changed, things have shifted.
Yeah,
And when we don't speak their name, it's like bottling it up again,
it totally is. Yeah, it totally
right?
is.
When we have every reason to speak of them and to remember them, the good, the bad, the ugly, all of it,
Mhm.
because how they
Right.
were in human form is how we knew them.
Exactly. That's
And
exactly it.
grief process is a chance for us to reconnect with them in spirit form, which
Mhm.
can be very different and can be very healing as well.
It can be very healing. This is one of the biggest issues I find with kind of the difficulties when people try to think about mourning versus ancestor veneration, right?
Mhm.
Or ancestor worship, or however we want to say it, right? Multiple traditions around the world refer to it differently, right? In the West, we relegate the dead to the past. And that is constantly one of the two questions that I always get is, how do you deal with somebody who was problematic when they were alive? And how do we deal with them now? Who are we if we descend from people who were really shitty people in life when they were alive? They're not alive any. They're not alive any.
Mhm.
Western culture relegates them to the past and prevents them from evolution. If
Yeah.
you speak to any spiritist or espiritista or any of those mediumship traditions around the world, they will all tell you the soul evolves, the soul changes. People have the ability to change and grow. And I
Yeah.
think that the Western world is starting to catch up with that, like general Western culture is starting
Yeah.
because we see it in our television shows, right? The Good Place shows us that people can evolve in death. And I love that and love that show so much because of that, right?
Yeah, I agree. I thought the
Mhm.
same thing. I thought, what a great concept and a quirky, fun way to give people a taste of that aspect. The full point of us even coming into human form, because we all are spirits, we are spirit beings having human experiences. And the
Yes,
whole point is for us to learn and evolve.
totally.
And the way I explain it, because I have the critics.
Yeah.
What do you mean? Because I try to explain to people there's not a heaven and a hell
Yeah.
the way the church tells us it is.
Mhm.
And that are there are people from our past
Mhm.
in history who have done horrible things. And they're like, what do you mean Hitler didn't go to hell? Hitler, the human,
Mhm.
did very horrible things,
Mhm.
but the spirit was
Yes.
on a spiritual journey and had to learn. And I take that kind of evil, very horrific things that we think of in
Mhm.
that humans can do, and it's all over.
Mhm.
And we still unfortunately see it today. I take it as those being young souls. They're at the beginning of their process and their evolution, and they will come back and learn more and we keep learning and evolving
Totally.
because our goal as spirits is to become enlightened, is to become at that point. And the way I explain it to people is people revere Jesus, let's say, because Jesus was already at an enlightened state.
Mm.
And we as spirits all strive to be at that. People like the Dalai Lama or Mother Teresa, they were all in a place of being more evolved or more enlightened than most of us at that point.
Mhm.
And that is, as spirits, that's what we strive to
Mm. Mhm.
achieve. Would you agree?
I would see. I totally agree in one level, but I totally disagree on another level. Again, it depends
Interesting.
on the
Okay.
kind of worldview. Because my own personal theology, my own personal way of looking at it is like the universe is different levels of existence, and so on one level of existence, and a big part of this book in the first two chapters is about worldview and questioning people about their worldview and what is it that you actually believe and how do you see, because then that will filter down into then ritual practice and what you actually do, right? I think that I've come to a place where I understand there are multiple different levels, and we're all in all of those different multiple levels. On the one hand, there is a sense of coming and learning and working towards enlightenment. I think on another level, there's also this piece around like soul contracts, right? This idea of us
Hmm.
coming in just in order to assist somebody else's learning because we do a shitty thing or they do a shitty thing to us, and so on and so forth. There's no reflection on us as individuals. I think there's also a piece there around the whole, like the divine living itself out, right? And so there's
Hmm.
almost like um, not a fatalism there, but a sense of we're chess pieces then in a vast game that the divine is playing with itself, right? And I can see all of those things being true. I also strongly think in non-linear terms when it comes to fate and destiny and things like that. I've got this tattoo to my body, which is the weird bind rune. I don't know if you know the concept of weird. So
I
the weird
don't.
bind rune it's a crisscross of 9 staves, and the runes can all be found within it. And the northern Scandinavian traditionally approach to fate is as an unfolding. So they see the entirety of reality as a constantly unfolding in the moment process, where everything fate of everybody is being constantly woven in the moment, right? We're stuck on these traverse scales where we're projecting into certain paths. Sometimes those paths intersect, sometimes they don't. But what matters is how we as souls are facing whatever's happening to us right now. And
Hmm.
sometimes we are caught in pathways that are just not going to change, not because some deity is saying, yes, you're going to go that way, but because of our own actions. That idea of karma, right? That whole idea of
Yes. Yeah.
kind of that piece, right? For me, I'm like, I agree completely with what you said, but I also like, in another way, and that's the mystery of life. I think all of it can be true, depending on the level. It's, yeah,
Absolutely,
goodness.
100%. And I learn things on a daily basis. And as I get more information from my spirit team and as I ask questions and piece things together, and a really good friend of mine is really into Buddhism and is in the process of learning a lot of that. And she has enlightened me in some regards in terms of reincarnation and stuff. So it made me think, okay, I want to dive a little bit deeper into that. We are forever evolving, as
Totally
is
are.
everything is always evolving,
Yes, this is the
right?
thing, and this is the thing. Another big piece of what I talk about in this book is even how we identify who we are, because this is a big question I often get when it comes to reincarnation versus afterlives, right? How can I connect with my dead brother or my dead sister or my parents or my grandparents if they are supposed to have reincarnated? There's this idea of soul parts in many traditions, right? There's a
Yeah.
personality exists in an afterlife that is accessible. The other parts of the soul go on and do other things, which
Mhm.
gets very timey-wimey very quickly.
It does. It does. And I have to explain that in a lot of regards because they're like, how could my sister and I have the same experience where we felt our father at the same time? I'm like, because spirit can be in two places at one time. They can be in multiple
Quantum,
places at
yes.
one time. Absolutely.
Right.
And this is where we have to shed the human thought, because humans, we physically can't be in two places at one time,
Mm-hmm.
but spirit can absolutely be in two
Totally can.
places.
Yes.
And part of the spirit can reincarnate, and there's still a spirit.
Yeah. It's like little blobby pieces, personality pieces all over the place, right?
And it's exactly the concept of what we think of atoms
Very much so.
scientifically.
Yeah.
And they multiply and they can be in multiple places at one time. It's hard because we keep looking at it from a human perspective,
Right.
but it's
And
not.
this is the idea of control, right? The
Yeah.
idea of we
Yeah.
needed to, we're taking a universal experience that cannot be expressed through our words, our senses, our vast amounts of reality that we just aren't experiencing because our five senses aren't attuned to it. And we're trying to shuffle it into a theology or a practice. And essentially what it always comes down to is relationship. How are you relating to things? Right? How are
Mhm.
you relating to the unseen? How are you relating to the seen? How are you relating? Because that's more important than necessarily the understanding of it. It's how you're relating. The relationship is inspired by the understanding, but we don't need to understand something to relate to it, right? And I think that's what gets people caught when it comes to death, because we don't understand death.
Yeah.
We have ideas, but we don't understand death. And
And
so
we don't talk about it.
and we don't talk about it. We don't test those things. We don't
Yeah.
express them. Yeah. So what I
I've
love
said
about
this
silent
multiple.
cafes. Sorry, go on.
Oh, I was going to say, I've said this in multiple times in my posts and things, that we talk about birth and we talk about the miracle of birth, and that's an exciting thing, but we never talk about death, nor do we plan death. And I read a great book by a friend of mine called Death Interrupted, by Dr. Blair Bingham. He is an emergency trauma doctor. And this book, I read it because I wanted to support my friend, but I thought it's going to be all medical jargon and I'm not going to understand. But I love Blair, so I'm going to plow through it. But it was great. It was so thought provoking because it
Hmm.
made you think about death differently. And it made me think about the message I put out there in terms of my relationship with death and how I connect people with spirit and teach them to connect
Yeah.
to the
Yes.
spirit of the people that have died in their lives. And just the way he talked about, we don't think about death. We don't talk about death,
Yeah.
when
We don't.
that should be something we plan, just like we try to plan everything else in our lives, right? We should be having these conversations because when that time comes, and it will, we act
Yeah.
like if we don't talk about it, it won't happen.
It won't happen, but it
And I
will.
think part of that is makes the impact of grief so much more severe
Yes.
when we have an understanding and we talk about it. Yeah, it's scary and it's uncomfortable, but sometimes those are the conversations that we need to have to honor wishes, to honor how we transition into spirit form again.
This is the thing. This is exactly it. And I think, again, it's a cultural issue. The Western world is not prepared for that because we're not having these conversations. We
Mhm.
used to. There used to be rituals embedded in the culture where, regardless of which culture, the idea of washing the corpse at home, the idea of the family taking care of the burial proceedings, right? The connection between the family and then their neighbors, and what was expected and what was appropriate and what was needed, right? That's been completely stripped away because of professionalization of the funeral industry. If we look at around the world, and this is what I did with this book, I did a cross analysis of multiple different traditions around the world. When
Love
we
it.
look at ancestral veneration in particular, it's a cultural form of preparing everybody and preparing the person who's about to die, the person who's already dead, the person who is over people who are surrounding them, right? Preparing them for the long journey of reintegration back into society. Because what do? We have these rituals where we're inviting them back every year in some cultures. What do? In some cultures, there's a shrine where we go and pray to them because they're no longer there to speak to, but we have the shrine that we can go to. And the cultural matrices is then going to support the individual. A friend of mine is currently visiting Sulawesi in Indonesia. And I don't know if you
Sorry,
have
where?
across Sulawesi in Indonesia.
Oh, okay. I'm having a harder
So,
time hearing you, so I'm not sure
oh,
if
that's weird. Okay, that's not great. Yeah, let me switch back to. I changed to my blue snowball, so maybe using issues. Perhaps that's better.
yeah, there we go. Much better.
$100 crap. There we go. We'll put that on. So he's visiting Sulawesi and in those in the Terahan culture, and I wrote about them in my own book, and I love them. Is because of the way that the funerary practices are, they hold big, elaborate funerals. And sometimes it takes years just to get to that point. And so what they do is they keep the dead body in the house and they treat the dead body as though the spirit, and they believe it, and I believe it, the spirit is still in that body, just waiting for their funeral, right? So they say they offer it food. Even look at how I'm talking about it. They offer it food. They offer the person food. They say, oh no, don't go and disrupt grandma. She's sleeping right now. She's not very well. She's leave her alone. And sometimes these bodies can be in the house for up to 20 years. And one of the, because
Wow.
of how elaborate, the higher up the social ladder you are, the bigger the festival is supposed to be. The whole community comes over and they have a necropolis. They have a space where the dead exist. It's like a dead village. And they have statuettes of the dead and whatnot. It was beautiful. And the woman who was being interviewed, her grandfather had died, or her father had died, something like that, and had been there for 10 years. And she said, I'm going to be really sad when he's not here anymore. Speaking about him now, I'm going to be really sad when I can't go and talk to him anymore and he's going to be gone. And that's going to be really sad. And so the interviewer, who was Australian, they were like, they died 10 years ago. And she said, yeah, I know we died 10 years ago, but he's still here. Look at him. So it's that cultural matrices and understanding of personhood with that. When somebody dies in the West, personhood is gone. We don't even talk about it anymore. They're gone. They get them buried in the ground as soon as possible, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Whereas in other cultures, the dead are still very much here because we have access to them. And
Yeah.
sometimes there's problems with that, right? Sometimes
Yeah.
it's like having, what's it called? National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation, right? Where all the family descend on the house and there's mayhem, right? But
Yeah.
it's a cultural way of dealing with grief and mourning, right? We
Yeah.
don't have that. We don't have that anymore. You know?
Yeah, it's true. And even after death, we still don't have those conversations.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think it's bottling it up. I think it prolongs the grief process in some way. I think I explained this to a friend recently because, and anybody who's tuned in before knows, I lost my brother to suicide. He died by suicide. And now I'm very aware of using the word lost. Thank you for pointing that out. So my brother died by suicide, and I don't wish that on anybody. It's traumatizing. There's so many questions. Watching my parents go through that process, we very instinctively go into protective mode. And for me, it was avoiding my own feelings so that I could try and help everybody else. And really what that did, it numbed myself because I just couldn't grasp the concept that actually happened, but it prolonged and really it ended up coming and kicking me in the ass later. And the thing that I found the hardest is in speaking about it or wanting to speak about it. Many people didn't want to hear about it. It was almost like they felt it was contagious. If we talked about suicide, and I'm realizing now this is on YouTube and I'm going to have to cut that out because you can't say that word. Unaliving is when we talk about that, people, it's almost like it feels contagious. If you talk about it, then it'll happen. And I don't want it to happen to me. So you will deal with it. That's yours to deal with.
Yeah.
That's not fair. That's not
It
fair.
isn't. It isn't.
It's not contagious. And for a while, I was a teacher for many years. And for a while, I was doing a lot of mental health awareness and unaliving prevention because I saw the need in kids. And I taught kindergarten to grade 8. And there were issues in all grades.
Mhm.
And I saw the need, and I did that kind of work in my classroom. And when I tried to step out of the classroom and do it, the biggest thing that was the biggest hurdle or obstacle was parents.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I would talk to them about what I did and how I helped kids with emotional regulation, identifying emotions, and as a preventative.
Mhm.
And they would say, "Oh, that work is so needed, but my kids are fine."
Exactly. Right.
And I knew, having been in a class for 20 years, I knew there
But
it
their
was
kids wasn't fine.
their kids are not fine.
No.
And I think the more we've in recent years exposed kids to traumas and the things that we see happening where schools are no longer the safe place they once were, and better in Canada than in the US.
Mhm.
But there are
Yeah.
still problems everywhere.
Yes.
I think we don't validate that it is a problem that needs to be addressed. It
Mhm.
is something that needs to be talked about, and not talking about it doesn't make it go away.
No, it doesn't. No, no, it doesn't.
It makes you unprepared when it does.
And this is then the leads to that other, oh, I didn't see this coming. How could this have happened? Oh, and then it just becomes about the parent or the survivor, right? It becomes about the individual who lost somebody, right?
Right.
And I remember years ago, just picking up on the bullying piece, right? I remember years ago, my local school board up here, Grey County, they had Barbara Colaroso come and speak. And I don't remember, do you remember Barbara Colaroso? The bullied and the bystander.
No, I
And
don't.
no, so she spoke, she put out a couple of books on bullying. This was 2000-ish. I'm dating myself now. And, and she came and spoke to the whole school board. And I went and met her because I was doing a project with one of the teachers around anti-LGBT bullying. And this was really this was around the time that Mark had fought in Oshawa to take his boyfriend to the prom back in the day.
I do remember that.
Yeah, and he speaks about it now like it was such an uphill battle, not just because it was Catholic school board, but because it was the parents, the
Yeah.
teachers. It was just blind. So, oh, if we say about it, it'll. Meanwhile, and I think that again, it's that idea of control, power over all the time, power over. If we don't talk about it, then it's not an issue, right?
Mhm.
And that's, I think, a very individualistic issue. I think that says a lot about individualism within the West. That
Mhm.
it manifests in other cultures, definitely, but particularly in the West. That's
Yeah.
that whole idea of individualism, sweep under the carpet, right? It's not an issue for you, out of sight, out of mind, right?
Mhm.
And it is so frustrating. And when it comes to the dead, what happens, and leads into some of the other work that I do, linking the ancestral work to my therapy stuff is about family patterns and family stories and family trauma, right? What do families often do? Sweep things they don't like under the carpet.
Hack them
Right?
in a closet.
Exactly. And this is a tried and tested and true thing. Somebody who does, I don't know if you've ever come across a genogram. Have you ever worked with a genogram before?
I have not.
So a genogram, so there's a fly buzzing around me that's bothering me here. So I'm just waving my arms in the air. So a genogram is a genealogical tree, but instead of tracking just relational information like births and deaths and one, it tracks things like addictions. It tracks things like subpersonalities. It tracks things like workaholism, alcoholism, things like that. It tracks information about the family unit and
Mhm.
how individuals are relating to each other. As part of my program, when I was studying, I had to do a 5-generational family tree in that way, genogram, going back 5 generations. So I had to ask stories about my family. I had to ask stories about what are some of the secrets about family. What was really neat when I was doing that was I had a helping hand because as I was going through researching and I was on ancestry.com looking at the old family records, you come across things where it was like a glimmer of a trauma, right? And you get this like idea in your head of, oh, she lost 6 kids before in infancy, right? Back in the 1800s. And you'd feel this overwhelming sadness. And then We don't talk about that. And
Yeah.
that's that cultural piece coming in. That's that spirit of the culture coming in and be like, no, we don't talk about that. That's too painful. So it's fascinating to have that dialogue with the ancestors as I was doing that work, but also interesting to see how it came up in my own family about how things were not talked about. Certain things were not talked about in the same way that society, in the same way that bullying is, the same way that school boards are, the same parents. Parents are very good at controlling information, and everybody does it.
Yes. And I agree to some aspect, you want to protect your kids, and I understand.
Totally.
But at the same time, you can't be with your kids 24 hours a day.
You can't. You can't.
You need to have conversations with them. And yep, it might be difficult.
Mm-hmm.
This is where you need to provide them with the tools so that when obstacles arise, when those hurdles arise, when things happen, and they can be really bad,
Mm-hmm.
they have the tools to have an open dialogue about it, to understand their emotions and their feelings around it.
Yeah.
I think that is less dangerous than not talking about it and then having to deal with the aftermath of it.
This is the thing. This is exactly it. And what's interesting with that is we can actually see over the generations, over the past, I'm a millennial, the kids who just came after me, and then the generation after that, the alphas, right? We can see the marked distinctions in how they are processing just by looking at how they're dealing and their social media, right? The generation alphas, when it comes to stuff like this, because they grew up with the internet in their hand. Mom and dad aren't giving them information. They're going on Tumblr. They're going on TikTok. They're going on to gain that information. And the type of therapeutic language that they're using now, it's, wow, where did you get that? Like, bypassing. Who told you about words, right?
Yeah.
But it's that access to information. And the same thing with us. This is why the culture wars that exist are constantly always coming up about controlling the media, right? Back in my, like for millennials, it was don't put that on television. We don't want that message to our kids. And when it was for the generation Zs, right? It was, oh, you have to look on the internet, ban on the internet. This is why the whole parental controls thing was built into many of those platforms, right? And then, of course, now it's with the TikTokers. No, we need to ban TikTok. We need to ban Instagram. We need to do this. We need to do that, right? And so and it's all about that social control of information. Don't worry, I'm not going to go down the conspiratorial road. I'm not there yet. But it is like how each of those generations are dealing with that trauma is very telling. We're seeing a swing among the earlier Gen Zers towards either being very left-wing or right-wing, depending. Philosophy, stoicism is a big part of particularly young men right now, because it's, you can do anything if you just suppress your emotions, just work through, go to the gym, build your body up, all of that stuff. And there's a whole trend around that. Versus my generation, which we were floundering about because we grew up with the latchkey kids. Oh, go and watch television. And what did most of us watch? Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Golden Girls. Maybe that's what I grew up with anyways. I don't know what everybody else did, but it's interesting then, even how we talk about our feelings. The younger kids, the alphas, no issues with talking about themselves and their feelings. No issues whatsoever. Oh, we're still here.
What says my internet connection is unstable? Where is it?
Oh, no.
Well, island living.
I hope did you hear most of what I said, or do you want me to repeat?
Repeat the last bit of what you said.
Yeah.
It got wonky there.
It got wonky there, yeah. With the alphas, we're seeing that they're talking a lot about their feelings. They're talking a lot about working through, but there's also a certain level of bypass there because of the internet generation and the wordage and the verbiage that they're using. So like unaliving, they're talking about unaliving. And to me, that takes away a little bit of it does, right? And the whole piece around trigger warnings too. It's don't trigger me. Again, that's just another form of control that older generations exhibited, that coming into that, right? I think we need to be sensitive about where people are at, but we also need to have very solid conversations about death and the realities of death. That's why I love people like Caitlin Doherty, who's not coming in with it from a spiritual point of view, but is talking about what actually happens when you die. what actually happens to the body afterwards, what actually happens, right? And I love her for that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I 100% agree. And I'm a Gen Xer.
Yes.
And it's funny because you said latchkey kids. Oh, yeah, we were totally left to our own devices and you don't talk about anything. And when you go out in public, you certainly didn't let people know the baggage you held, right? So it's all about bottling,
It's
and children should be seen and not heard. And
obvious. Yeah.
so there was no talking. And so it's interesting going through my own healing process and looking back on my family's history,
Mhm.
seeing the trauma that was passed down. And that was just me doing it myself
Yeah.
and understanding, oh, that's why this person was like this. And that's why this happened. And that explains the alcoholism that runs in this side of the family. And right. And there were so many
Yeah.
things that led me to my own healing by
Yes.
understanding what came before me.
Totally. It totally
But
does.
I also attribute that my brother's death forced me to look back. And in
Yeah.
turn, now I say my brother's death saved my life.
That makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. So for you then, where do your ancestors fit into that saving of your life? Like in connecting with them and communicating with them? How does that fit for you?
For me, it's an acknowledgement that I've broken the chain,
Okay. Yeah.
that it stops with me. And I don't say that from a place of arrogance. I say it from a
Mhm.
place of gratitude and understanding and reconnecting with my ancestors in understanding that time and that place was very different than now.
Yeah.
And that what they've been through was a process that needed to happen in order for me to learn to enlighten myself,
Mhm.
basically, to understand that process. And it's hard and it's scary and it can feel overwhelming at times. And it's up and down even still. But I keep remembering this is a learning process and this is all about me trying to be the best me that I can be and
Yes.
to leave a weight for those who come after me
Yeah.
to be in a better place.
That's
And
exactly it. Yeah.
that's exactly what we are meant to do in human form.
Yes.
You're meant to.
That legacy piece is really big.
Yeah.
That legacy piece is really big. And I think in truth, when we look at these traditions around the world, these cultures around the world where there is that third level of an ancestor veneration practice, I like that is what is being taught through that and facilitated through that, right? The idea of the legacy, you've got your individual legacy, but yes, but you've also got the family legacy, and the family legacy is we're part of that link in that chain. We
Mhm.
become then a link in that chain. And who are we connected to? The next link and the next link, the next link. Even if we don't have biological children ourselves, we're still making those waves, that legacy piece, and in that unfolding and being ancestors in waiting. That's what we are. But if we're so caught up in the past, in the trauma of the past, and we then perpetuate that trauma link chain, right? We're not focused on that legacy piece, right?
Abs-
Yeah.
And that in turn makes me think of my aunts and uncles who I'm estranged from, most of them.
Mhm.
And I look and I've forgiven them for the things that they've done. And there's been traumas that they have done purposely to hurt me.
Mhm.
And I've forgiven that because when I look back on my ancestry and I look at the pattern, they have not evolved. They have not,
Mhm.
they are still deep in trauma, unacknowledging. And I understand that they're at a different level of consciousness than I am. And that has led me to having the ability to forgive them.
Mm.
Doesn't mean I have to hang out with them.
Yeah. And or condone what they did. Right.
Oh,
That's the other piece.
exactly.
Yeah.
But it gives me the ability to see it from a spiritual perspective and not a human perspective. And it almost makes me feel sorry for them because I see them trapped and not acknowledging their own trauma, not acknowledging the patterns
Yes.
that were handed down. And this is where my gratitude comes in, and not just for my brother, for all the powers that be that brought me to a place that I was able to open my eyes objectively
Mhm.
to all of it. And that is really what got me to a place of healing. Hard,
Right.
and it's hard work. It's not easy.
It isn't easy work. No, it
I
isn't easy
spent
work. No.
7 years on the brink of unaliving myself in this process.
Yeah.
So it's hard work, but it can be done. And this is why I'm passionate about teaching people to tap into their own intuitive abilities because we
Mhm.
all,
Mhm.
and when we start going inward, it projects outward and it affects our work.
And that interrelationship, right? And I talk a lot about that in the book too, is that interrelationship piece. It's not just about us, right? And a lot of people who I think when they become interested in magic or intuitive skills or ancestor work or anything spiritual, it's I'm going to be the spiritual guru type, right? I can the whole wounded healer thing. And that's not looking down on it too badly, but it's just that question of, okay, who's actually being healed? If you're a wounded healer, you're trying to heal somebody else, you're actually healing yourself with that. Is that what this is actually about, right?
I think it goes hand in hand. The best teachers are also still in the process of learning.
There's a difference there, though, I think, where at what point does it become more focused on you? And for some people, it's more about themselves and healing themselves. And the healing of others is an accessory to that, as opposed to it being more of an equal share. That's more where I was going with that.
Yeah, no, that's a
Yeah,
fair assessment. That's a
yeah.
fair assessment. But I think there's always a process when we are helping somebody else, we are also still learning. There are times where,
You can't
you know,
not be, right? Hmm.
exactly, where some dialogue or some interaction that I've had with a client or in helping somebody with what they're going through, I step back and go, oh, it put a piece of
Hmm.
the puzzle in place for me as well.
Hmm. Yeah.
And I think this is the benefit of talking about these things, of
Yeah.
making these connections, because it can help us in ways
Oh,
that we may
completely.
not understand right now, but
Yeah.
we will eventually.
Exactly. And I think like, to jump off of that point, that goes again back to that interrelationship piece, right? The lack of control piece. When we surrender this false sense of control and we admit that, okay, our experience is like other people's experience. There are commonalities here. This isn't just this happened to me, woe is me. It's okay, I can learn from this because I can let go of the blame of self. Because that's another big piece there too. When people get into that wounded state, as a protector, I see it with my clients all the time. I deserved this, or sometimes this was meant to happen because I'm learning and I'm meant to learn this. And as painful as it is, I just have to accept it. It's that idea of letting go of that blame and that self blame and being
Yes.
like, okay, yeah, this happened. It happened to me. And because it also happened to other people, I'm not alone. Right.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I always say, and this became my mantra as well in my healing process, don't ask the question, why is this happening to me?
Hmm.
Ask the question, why is this happening for me?
Yeah.
Right? What am I meant to learn from this? And it may be a process you may not understand right away, but when
Mhm.
we shift that thinking, it it allows us to open up to the possibilities of those lessons we are meant to learn.
Absolutely. And I think it also gives nuance too, to allow us to understand that there are some things that happen that there is no lesson, right? What is, when somebody dies, what is the refrain some people say? Why did they do this to me?
Yes. Yeah.
And it isn't about,
Why did they
right?
leave me?
Why did they leave me? How could you do this to me? They died. That's what they naturally do. Everybody dies. They didn't do it to you. They didn't consciously think, I'm going to die today so this other person will be right. I'd hate to think of someone being so spiteful that they would give their life up to hurt somebody else. Yeah.
Yeah. And that ties into the unaliving because
Mhm.
the, there was a lot of stigma. There is, not was, there is a lot of stigma to that. And people saying things like, it's a selfish act. I don't think it is.
I don't
I
think so.
People don't understand unless they've been in that situation
Mhm.
just how it's not even an act of thinking that they need to do it to themselves.
Mhm.
The way I described it when I was dealing with that kind of ideation, it's not so much that I wanted to die, I wanted to disappear. And so when we put that label on it that it's a selfish act, it's actually, it's not about being selfish. It's about being so beyond understanding of self. It's that desire to disappear.
That's exactly it, right? And people make it about themselves in those moments and then end up punishing that person who went through that experience.
Mhm.
And then what do? We forget about them. We don't talk about them. We think, oh, if they are being selfish that way, and if they were selfish that way, other people, it'll inspire other people to be selfish. We don't want that. So we're just going to not talk about it. And yeah,
Mhm. It all is part of the complexities of grief, the
it
complexities of
is.
human condition.
Yeah, it is.
But this is all, the more we talk about it, the more understanding we have, and the more hopefully we can support each other through it. That is the
Well, and this is the thing. This is exactly it. I think that what's happening in Canada, at least with MAID, medical assisted dying, I think that hopefully will shift the conversation to this, a lot of these decisions being informed decisions. It's about consent then, right? Where I work, there's somebody who does a podcast, but particularly on MAID, and I've had some really fascinating conversations with Kerry about this, and some of the challenging again, the presuppositions around what it means about that person if they've decided they want to make the decision that end will be theirs. They get to make that choice. They get to make that. They have control over that. For a universe where we really don't have much control over anything, to have a little bit of control over something like that, very empowering, not a selfish, right?
I agree 100%. And
Yeah.
that I had mentioned Death Interrupted by my
Mhm.
friend Blair Bigham. He talks about MAID and he talks about those
Mhm.
decisions and the complexities of those decisions,
Mhm.
and that we do need to still have more conversations. But it's touching on what you just said, the empowerment of giving somebody that choice.
Mhm. Yeah,
And I think I'm hoping we start talking more about that as well.
I think so too. I think so too. My hope is that I'm not sure if it will happen necessarily at a full cultural level, but my hope is that as those programs start to filter out into the rest of the Western world, my hope is that hospice networks and death doulas and spiritual specialists will start to then develop rituals to include that person as they go through that process, and then the community afterwards, right? Because there is such religious stigma around it. But most people are not religious in that way anymore, right?
It's
People are
true.
starting to find their own way. I'm assuming here, I don't know if you are or not, but have you ever come across the spiritism as opposed to spiritualism? Have you ever come across them?
No,
No.
actually,
So, okay. So spiritualism is like Lily Dale and the mediumship of the Fox sisters and whatnot, right down in New York, very North American based and also English. Spiritism is its cousin, which was started in France, and this is where you'll see it down in the Caribbean there. And the Espiritistas or Espiritismo is connected to Spiritism as opposed to spiritualism. And Spiritism was founded by Allan Kardec. He was a French scientist, actually. He worked for, like, he was one of those pseudo psychotherapy types, right? Back in the 1860s. And he gathered a load of mediums together because he was hearing what spiritualists in North America were doing. And he wanted to test these out. And he started to develop a system around doing seances and testing mediums and asking the same questions with different groups of mediums to test what the answers were coming back. And there were some fantastic results which were very consistent. So he developed a whole system called Spiritism and practices and whatnot. And so there's a movie about his life. It's a Brazilian movie because when Spiritism was spread around the world, it really took off in Brazil for some odd reason. There's 5 million of them down in Brazil. There's a center up in Toronto here. They're worldwide, but like 5 million of them in Brazil. And so there's a Netflix movie about his life, and it's called Kardec, Kardek. And one of the scenes is he's at a bridge and he sees somebody who he knew, and he was an old gentleman, and he had fought in the Napoleonic Wars back 50 years before. And he is just in this state, and he goes and he unalives himself. And he pops back up in one of the mediumship circles, the seances, and they chat with him about what his experience was. And his experience, and I can't think where it is in one of Kardec's books, but he talks about how the darkness that he's existing in the spiritual realm is all because of the shame that he carried in with him because of that religious dogma that he was carrying. But he was in such a state, he just couldn't exist anymore. He couldn't live anymore. And so part of then the ritual process was to get him to out of that darkness. And that whole ritual process of enlightening beings and giving them light, giving them energy. I thought that was so wonderful. And the scene itself, like he speaks through the medium about what it's like for that light to come to him and for the sport and for him to be lifted out of that darkness, of that shame. And I thought, okay, that's fantastic. If we can do that on a grander scale for others, I think that will be really powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to look more into that. That's fascinating.
I'll send you the name of it. It's on Netflix and it is dubbed in English too. And so it's like Brazil has such a huge spiritist population down there that they actually have a full film industry around it. It's fantastic. Yeah.
Fascinating. That is awesome. And I think we could probably talk for
hours and hours and hours.
right? Cut it off somewhere. But I think this opens the door to having you back if you're willing.
I would love to. Yeah, please.
Because I think the more we talk about it, the more we empower others to talk about it. And that's always my goal. And it sounds like that's your goal as well. So thank you so much for being here. I look forward to picking up your book and reading it. It's fascinating. You touched on so many fascinating aspects of it that I'm like, I need to read that book. And thank you for the work that you're doing. I think in the space that you're working and how you're helping people, I think that's really commendable and it's so needed right now. So
it is. I have my work cut out for me. I'm moving to the UK in about 6 months' time, 7 months' time, and they are even worse when it comes to death than North Americans are. So I will see what happens. I might start shaking a load of people. You never know.
You're going to be shaking the apple tree, so to speak. That will be a fascinating journey for you as well, and to see the differences and going back in for you. Okay, so let's pop you back because there's more clearly that needs to be talked about and that we need to touch on. And your experiences are also going to change, which will also be fascinating to tap into. So thank you so much for being a part of this and for spreading that knowledge and clearly the passion that you have in this topic. And I'm going to ask those of you who tuned in, reminder, hit that subscribe button. Send this to people who you think can benefit from hearing it, because I think the more we share positive things like this, the better it is for the world. And tune in next time.
Thank you, everybody.